The Trek Fuel EXe and the rail are as different as a cross-country bike is to a downhill bike, and it's really important to understand this distinction. However, whilst a downhill bike cannot climb like say a cross-country bike can, both the fuel and rail are similar in so many ways. They both love single track, they have similar amounts of travel, they can both descend tough terrain at around about the same speed. They have removable batteries, lively suspension and similar angles designed for all-round riding. So what makes them so fundamentally different? The Trek Rail and Fuel EXe are very much the border collies of the MTB world. And yet, the Fuel EXe does have parents of different pedigrees, both an MTB and a full power EMTB. So you could argue it's kind of a crossbreed, which is why we've come to the Lake District, land of the border collie. So what makes the Fuel EXe and the rail so fundamentally different? Well, you could argue that the Fuel EXe is a lot lighter than the rail, but this is not a comparison between a lightweight EMTB and a heavyweight EMTB. No, the fundamental difference is power. The rail has more torque and a higher peak power, 85 Nm compared to 50 Nm, and a peak power that is almost double that of the 300 given by the fuel. And the weight, there's actually a 6-pack of beer difference in weight between the fuel and the rail. But as you can see, the Fuel EXe does have a lot leaner down tube. The big question is, will you get more of a 6-pack riding the fuel over a rail? Not at all. That is simply a myth. But as much as we can argue the toss, agonise over the fine details, both bikes open the door to more riding, different riding, and I would happily argue all day long, more fun. And I think many people like fun, don't they? I have to thank Trek for inviting us up here to the beautiful Lake District on this brisk autumn day to have a look at the fine detail of these very stunning bikes. And basically what we're going to be doing is looking at the strengths and weaknesses of both bikes and the impact that will have on you, the rider, on where you can ride and how you can ride. Oh, hello Doglet. The Fuel EXe offers subtle support on the climbs, is silent, tries to be more like a traditional MTB, and as Trek say, it does have a traditional trail bike feel on the descents. It's lighter than the rail, it's quieter, it's a bike that avoids arguments with rock and root rather than confronting them. The rail on the other hand, more speed, more power, more distance, more terrain. It's a bit heavier, yes, 22 kilos versus 19. Has got 10 mil more travel front and back, a bigger fork, is slacker, longer, and just a bit more beef to its intentions. Of course, some people would argue that they're not actually that dissimilar. They both have roughly the same travel and wheel size and geometry. They both have adjustable motors. They both come with a fantastic app. You can adjust the travel and the geometry of both bikes, and they're both perfectly suitable for the terrain we're riding out in the lakes. But I might just stay here just a little bit longer. The rail will be able to climb technical trails faster. That's the biggest difference. More torque enables riders to push through the steps quicker. The overrun allowing the rider more of a breather, and heavier riders
will benefit more from power on tech climbs, that's for sure. But what's the reality? Let's take a look at some real-world examples.
Well, here's a classic example, I think. We've got a knuckly, steppy approach to the track here, whereas on my left-hand side, we've got a smoother approach. And I think this actually typifies the both approaches which you might take on the higher powered bike on the right or the lower powered bike on the left. The line of least resistance or the super tech. Obviously, if you've got the technique and the weight and the power, then the Fuel EXe will get up there every day of the week. You crack on. Okay, folks, let me introduce you to classic rail territory. Big, nasty rocks. Oh, physical, technical. So I got to concentrate for a minute. Oh, wow. Okay, take a breather. Seat up, go again.
But remember, the Fuel EXe is also still very adept in the mountains compared to standard MTB.
The great thing about the Fuel is it's still super capable on these climbs, but when you come to a piece which isn't rideable, then it's easy to just pick it up and shoulder it and get up that section. Whereas the rail, obviously being a little bit heavier, quite as easy. So obviously strength and power is another thing to think about with the two bikes.
The Fuel is a bike that will glide by you with the motor at full song and nobody will know. You will also have an outline similar to a standard Fuel. You'll be able to kid people you're riding an MTB. You'll be able to carry it easier when your route planning has got AWOL in the mountains, and you'll be less likely to spin out on a slippy climb.
But more than this, it is such a lightweight, lively, capable bike, and it is simply made for the mountains. This bike, on the other hand, is simply made for trouble. If you can ride down it, I guarantee you there's a good chance you'll be able to ride back up it. But there are some other fundamental differences on paper we should go through very quickly. Okay, some numbers then, some weights and measures of the two bikes. As I mentioned earlier, the Fuel weighs in around about 19 kilos, whereas the Rail 22. And the difference in that is the motor and battery. There's a 3.4 kilo difference in the battery and the motor on both bikes. When it comes to price, now there's a £2,000 difference in the higher end bikes. The higher end Fuel EXe is slightly more expensive than the Rail, whereas on the lower price point bike, 4,900 on the Rail, whereas the Fuel EXe start at 6,000. Elsewhere, we've got some features. For example, the Fuel EXe has got a feature called watts per kilometre, or watt hours per kilometre I should say, which is a really nifty feature, whereas on the Rail you've got a feature with the Bosch motor which is called hill hold. Elsewhere, when it comes to the motors, both motors deliver the power very differently, so you need to ride both to get used to that. And also there's a difference in the sound levels. The Fuel EXe is, you can hardly notice it, whereas the Bosch CX motor on this bike, obviously there's a little bit of noise because, well, let's face it, there's a lot more power. One thing which is really important to understand is that even though the bikes are only 3 kilos difference in weight, they do behave very, very differently on the trail. And you could say that's more of a trail bike, that's more of an enduro bike. But I think the reason for that is the suspension tune. It's the way the frame's constructed. And when you ride down, say, a very rocky descent, you'll definitely get more feedback through the bike than you will on, say, the Rail. The Rail is much more of a planted bike. But there's other things to think about as well. And I talked about the climbing. Even though this bike will not climb as quickly as that bike, when you get to some very difficult pitches, you can literally just get off that bike, chuck it on your shoulder and walk a section. Whereas this bike, it's a little bit more involved. So a couple of differences there. Now, another part of the story and this compare and contrast versus the two bikes is the fact that The fuel has got a lyric fork up front, whereas the rail has got a Zeb. Now that will have a big difference in terms of the impacts. When you're hitting those rocks and roots, this bike will feel a little bit different to the more burly fork on the rail. At the same time, you can actually put a bigger and longer fork on the fuel. Say you can go up to sort of, 160 fork on this. You can stick a coil in it if you want to. But you know what? I actually think that's moving away from the actual nature of the bike, what it's made for. I definitely think this is more of a trail center, fire road climbing bike compared to the rail bike. At the same time, you can actually lower the weight on the rail down to say 20 kilos by putting lighter wheels on it, thinner fork, and getting onto some lighter components. So you can change the both bikes, but I don't think you need to. Now, whilst the focus of this video is fuel rail, I think maybe a more valid conversation should be fuel EXe versus non-assist bike. And I mean, in a situation such as this, you might as well bring a canoe because you're going to be carrying, that's for sure. I really do think that if you're a heavier rider and you're doing this type of terrain, like a fire road climb, then followed by a super technical descent or a trail center descent, then this bike is great. It's just that when you come to the more technical climbs, the big collisions and steps, that's where the heavier rider might actually prefer the rail far more than this bike. And the reason for that is twofold. A is that you'll be able to tackle it pedaling, feet up, and B is you might be able to use a lesser power mode and therefore less battery. Okay, so what goes up, oh crikey, must go down. Now remember, this is a trail bike and this is proper, full-on Lakeland rock. But those big 29-inch wheels, we've got it. We can get through this stuff. I mean, it is proper full-on. Now the Fuel EXe is light and nimble. And for those people who are new to e-mountain biking, they might find it a lot more, a lot more easy to understand when you're riding it compared to the slightly heavier rail.
The rail, on the other hand, will happily collide with badness all day long, going down as well as up. That bigger fork, slightly more travel and slightly more weight equates to a more planted, grippier ride.
The motors, obviously very different power outputs on the two bikes, 85 Newton meters on the Bosch motor on the rail and 50 Newton meters on the TQ motor on the fuel. But also two very different design philosophies. Now there's the harmonic pin ring system on the TQ, and then there's the traditional gearing method on the Bosch motor on the rail. But they also deliver their power difference, but it's not a question of one being better than the other, they're simply different. So you've now progressed from double track into a little bit more technical climbing, and this is where on these steps and loose rock that the rail just got that little bit more, well, a lot more punch to get you up and over. Now coming into the same gap on the Fuel EXe, and physically more challenging. You've got to keep your eye on the game. You've got to make sure your momentum is good. Still doable, don't get me wrong, it's just it does require a lot more technique, the heavier rider. Okay, so battery time. Now let's not forget that the battery in the Fuel is one of the highest density, lowest weight batteries on the market. It's 360 watt hours, weighs in at 1.8 kilograms. Now you can actually get a range extender, which is 160 watt hours, but I'm thinking on that bike, just get another spare battery, 360 watt hours. They're so dinky, you can stick that in your backpack. It means you've got 720 watt hours of range, which is ridiculous for such a lightweight bike. The rail has got 750 watt hours, 4.4 kilos, but remember that bike has got more power. So the main consideration to bear in mind when you're looking at batteries is how much do you weigh, where do you ride, and actually how long do you ride for? So in conclusion then, maybe 2 breeds, focused, full of energy, and of course loyal. But folks, e-bikes and mountains, whatever power you choose, it doesn't get much better.